learn.ba.
In this video, I want to talk about requirement sessions, and very specifically, I want to talk about some of the things that you can do to make sure that your requirement sessions are effective and that they go well. So first, what I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about what requirement sessions are, and then I'm going to offer you a couple of pointers that are going to help you. So throughout a project, there are different stages of the project itself, and then within the analysis portion of those stages, there are different activities they have to take part in, or that you have to execute as part of making sure that the analysis portion of the project gets done. Requirements sessions are one of those activities, and they are one of the key activities because that is one of the places where you have the opportunity to clarify and elicit and analyze the requirements. Okay, so basically what happens is the way that you do requirements typically is that you determine the scope, and then what you do is you refine the scope all throughout the analysis portion of the project. Okay, when you're refining the scope, you have to make sure that you can meet with the right stakeholders so that a lot of the requirements that you have are being refined down the right path. And I'll talk about that process a lot more, but let's talk very specifically about what requirements sessions are. I'm actually on my way to a client site for a requirement session right now, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this. So tip number one that I would have is that you have to do your homework, okay? The second thing that I'm going to talk about is that you have to make sure that you've chosen the right tools. And number three, I want to talk about a very specific tool that I call handouts, meeting handouts. It seems like a very simple thing, but I'm going to talk about why you should always have meeting handouts in a meeting. Okay, so let's talk about doing your homework. Before you even plan out or attend the session, that is when the majority of your work should be happening. Okay, I'll say it again because this is very, very important, and it's a point that I think a lot of new business analysts don't necessarily catch on to right away, is that the majority of the work for your requirement session happens outside of the meeting itself. So for example, the meeting that I'm going to right now is 2 hours long. I have done at least 4 hours of prep work, and even more than that if you take into account a lot of the stuff that's led up to this. But this morning, I've done at least 4 hours of prep work before I go in, and after the meeting, I'm probably going to do another 2 hours of work to make sure that I've captured everything right. Okay, so that should hit the point home that the majority of your work that happens for a requirement session happens mostly before and a little bit after. Okay, so when I say do your homework, that's what I'm talking about. It is all of the work that you have to do before you show up to a session. So what kind of work is it? You should never ever show up to a requirement session empty-handed and expect people to tell you what the requirements are or to start speaking about a certain area of business. Okay, that's going in cold. You're going in cold into a meeting, and the chances of that meeting working out well are extremely low. However, it is something that new analysts who don't have a lot of experience tend to do a lot of, because they see the requirements meeting as the starting point of the process. It is not the starting point of your process. You should be midway through a lot of the stuff that you're working out before you actually show up to the requirement session. Okay, so do your homework, which means number one, you should have some clarity of what the scope of the project is. So you should not be going into the meeting saying, okay, tell me what you want, or what should be in scope for this project. Those conversations typically happen well before you get into a detailed requirement session, okay? The people that you have those types of conversation with typically are the project sponsor. That's usually the best place to start. The person who's funding the project at the management level, they're gonna give you some ideas of what they think is needed, right? And what you're gonna do is that becomes basically the seed for the scope of your project, right? And so when you have the seed, then you can detail it out to a couple of bullet points. Could be some system functionality, it could be something else, but essentially what you do is you make sure you've had a lot of those conversations before you step foot into the first requirement session that you had. Because if you're talking down at the user level in most cases and you don't have clarity on the scope, you can start to spin, because they might ask for things, and right there in the meeting you don't have the ability to say that I think that that may be out of scope for our project. You need to have that ability. Okay, so the scope is very, very important depending on where you are in the requirements process. On my project right now, I'm very deep into it, so I have a lot of material to go in with. But when I first started off this project a couple of months ago, the material I was going into my requirement sessions with was a lot thinner. But you have to make sure that you have the subject matter that you need to discuss clearly outlined. Okay, when I talk about handouts, I'm going to talk about the agenda and what type of things you should do in your agenda. Okay, the other part of doing your homework is to make sure that you understand who the stakeholders are that are attending this session. And when I say who they are, I don't mean just the name and the role. What I mean is that you have to get a little bit of background on who the person is, possibly what some of their history, some of their relevant history to your project on this project might be. So for example, if you're going in to meet with a user who has been managing cases, for example, it's very important for you to know that this person's been working at the company for the last 10 years and they've worked for 4 different lines of business, and that's the type of input that they're going to be coming into the meeting with, right? It's important for you to know who the person is, what kind of history that they have, and if you can get to the really important information about a person, you want to get some insight into what kind of issues this person is likely to be concerned with. Because what that does for you is that it starts to help you identify, preemptively start to identify some of the issues that they may raise in the meeting. And so as part of your prep work, what you can start to do is you can already start to think through some of that stuff and maybe even start to formulate some answers in advance. Okay, that's why you need to do a lot of the prep work as part of your homework, right? So knowing who's attending the meetings is very, very important. Knowing what angle that they're coming to the project from is very, very important. Okay, that in itself, if you don't do those things, what you're doing is you're going into the meeting cold, and you're going to be caught off guard over and over and over again, because people might start discussing subjects that you might not have been necessarily ready to discuss, or people will come to things from an angle that you did not even think about, and you might not have a lot of answers for some of the questions that they have right up front. Okay, so do your homework. Number 2 is choose your tools, and choose your tools very wisely. Now again, at the beginning of the project, it can be a little bit difficult if you don't know who the stakeholders are. Okay, when I say choose your tools, I'm talking very, very specifically about 2 different things that you're going to use. Number 1 is what I like to call the primary display. So when you're in the room, where is everybody's focus going to be directed? That is what I call the primary display. A lot of times it's a projector on the screen where you're showing the material that's on your laptop. That's a very common one. Another one is that you could have a whiteboard where you walk into the meeting earlier and you draw out a couple of things that explains, kind of sets the framework for the rest of the meeting, and kind of you could actually even put your agenda on there. But a lot of times what I do with whiteboards is that I use it to draw out conceptual diagrams, especially if it's a data heavy project. There's a lot of conceptual analysis that needs to be done, and I draw those things out so that we can have a meaningful discussion about it when the meeting starts. So make sure that you've chosen the right primary display. If you have Visio on your laptop and you have diagrams that you need to show, you have to make sure that that is the right tool that you've chosen. If it's subject matter that's very dense, typically what you want to do is you want to try to stay away from Visio. Like, I've used Visio for many years over time, but since I've started using whiteboards to do the work, that portion of the requirements work, I've realized that people tend to stay with you a lot longer if they're with you on the journey of drawing things out one step at a time on a whiteboard versus just putting up a diagram, a Visio diagram on the screen. So those type of things all help to make you and your requirement sessions go a lot more smoothly. Secondary display. Okay, when the participants' attention is not on the primary display, what are they looking at? Where are they paying attention? That is very important, again, because if you need to get to the bottom of important answers, you have to be able to retain people's attention in these sessions. Okay, if you lose people's attention, if people start just, dozing off or not paying attention, a lot of the things that you need to get out of that session are not going to happen. You might have to schedule another one, or you might have lower quality requirements as a result. The secondary display that I talk about is what I mean by handouts. You should always have a secondary display in the form of handouts, because there are many things that a handout does for you in a session that you would have to do yourself if you did not have those handouts. So number one is that having handouts that you give to a person almost immediately takes their attention away from you and onto the subject matter. So instead of the person or the set of people in the room looking to you to start talking right at the beginning of the session, what they start to do typically is they start to flip through the handouts that you have, because they want to understand what some of the subject matter that needs to be discussed in detail are. Immediately what that does for you, and this is important for you especially if you're new, and if you're nervous running these types of sessions, having a handout takes their attention away from you so that you can compose yourself right at the beginning of the meeting, and that you can start to lead the session by pointing different things out in the handout. Okay, the amount of pressure that takes off of your shoulders right from the get-go is hugely beneficial. It is hugely beneficial. The second thing that the handouts do is that as you're having the conversation throughout the meetings, what you can do is you can start to refer to the different parts of the handout at different points in the conversation. What that does for you is that it reduces the cognitive load, right? And what I mean by cognitive load basically is that it reduces the number of things that you have to memorize, because if it's especially again, if these are dense subjects on tough projects, you trying to memorize all of the details that need to be talked about is going to weigh you down. It's going to wear out your level of energy throughout the session trying to recall things all the time. And so the other thing that your handouts do for you is that they let you take all of that memory that you would have had to have, put it in a document. And when somebody asks a question, you say, well, hold on a second, I think I have this subject you're asking about covered on page number 4. Let's flip to that to see what that looks like, right? That in itself, again, is a very effective strategy, to help you reduce the load that you have to deal with, reduce the pressure and to reduce the load. And what that does is it frees you up to start facilitating the conversation. And many people, when they start to go through the handouts, almost immediately you'll start to see that they're a lot more interested, because chances are they've seen something that they're interested in talking about in one of the handouts, and so they just can't wait to get to it, right? Your handouts should always have, the first page of your handout should always be an agenda. So what you do at the beginning of your requirement session is that you review the agenda before you discuss anything in detail. You review the agenda and you always ask the question, is there anything we should add into this agenda before we start the session? What that does for you is that it makes sure that if what that does for you is that it makes sure that any concerns that the person might have coming into the meeting get addressed immediately, right? You give them a placeholder in the agenda so that they're not feeling anxious throughout the meeting, and that they're not always feeling like they have to jump into a conversation, because they know that the things that are on their mind are going to get discussed when you get to that agenda item. So you display the agenda and you very specifically ask, is there anything else we should be adding to this agenda before we move on? If you follow these tips, the requirement sessions that you hold are guaranteed to go a lot more smoothly. Okay, a lot of new analysts, I think, make a lot of assumptions about what requirement sessions are, and those assumptions don't always match the expectations of the participants who are attending the sessions. And so the more homework that you do, the better you get at choosing the right tools, and the better you become at reducing the load on your own shoulders throughout the session. All three of those things is going to help you in making sure that you're getting what you need out of those requirement sessions. If you're interested in learning more about business analysis, I'm going to encourage you to go over to the website at learn.ba. We have a number of articles that have been published there, and we're starting to publish a lot of these videos and other videos that we have from our training program onto the website for everybody to watch. There is plenty of material there for you to learn, and please feel free to comment and ask questions. If there are things in there that you don't understand, or there are things in there that you want me to elaborate on, ask a question in the comment section, and I will try to get to it as early as possible. The questions that receive the most requests are typically the ones that get answered first. So head over to the website at learn.ba, read the articles, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next video.